Well, good morning. My name is Nancy Weiss, and I'm General Counsel of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and I'm very pleased to moderate Session 2 of today's symposium. I'm joined here with Jonathan Band, PLLC, Eric Schwartz, who is a partner at Mitchell, Silverberg, and Knupp. Yeah. I'm here with Mary Minow, who is the Follett Chair at Dominican University's Graduate School of Library and Information Science. She's also counseled to CALIPA, a California library consortium. And we're also joined with Mark Seeley, who is the General Counsel of Elsevier. So we have a very experienced panel here. During the session, we'll explore Section 108 issues other than mass digitization. We have another couple of panels on that. Each panelist is going to make introductory comments as what they see as the current relationship between libraries and the copyright system. We'll then delve into some questions concerning the language and the scope of Section 108. Next, our panelists will share their thoughts on what they believe is the ideal framework for library exceptions. And finally, we'll open the discussion, taking questions from you, the audience. And we've actually already had some very interesting questions that we can follow up on. So the Institute of Museum and Library Services is a federal agency. We have responsibility for the development and implementation of policy to ensure the availability of museum, library, and information services adequate, and this is long, to meet the essential information, education, research, economic, cultural, and civic needs of the people of the United States. The agency is authorized to advise the President, Congress, and other federal agencies and offices on museum, library, and information services in order to ensure the preservation and dissemination of knowledge. And IMLS has a special role when it comes to Section 108. As the overview document in the materials prepared by Mary Rassenberger, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold too, and Chris Weston reflects, one of our predecessor agencies, the National Commission on Libraries and Information Science, played an important part in informing the Section 108 legislative process, and the agency is also committed to supporting educated and informed decision-making. Copyright laws have long recognized the essential role of libraries in achieving the system's goal of encouraging creativity, innovation, and learning. What not everybody knows about the Statute of Anne, enacted in 1710, is that it required the delivery before publication of copies of books for the use of the Royal Library, university libraries, and the library belonging to the Faculty of Advocates at Edinburgh, a law library. The Statute of Anne was an act for the encouragement of learning, and libraries were recognized as a part of and important to this purpose. Libraries continue to be central to the knowledge ecosystem, and we, as Maria, the registrar, said earlier this morning, our country has long recognized the fundamental role of libraries in sustaining our democracy, in promoting economic development, education, and access to information. So as we learned this morning, the Section 108 study group reviewed the current provisions to see whether updates were necessary to address changes in technology. A lot has occurred since the study group met together. Today we have an opportunity to review the current provisions to help us to continue to ensure that the copyright system's goals are met through effective library exceptions. So with that, I'd like to turn to our panelists and ask them to make a few introductory comments. Remember Jonathan Band.
Okay, so there we go. Okay, thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you all for coming today. Very briefly, I represent the Library Copyright Alliance, which includes the American Library Association, the Association of Research Libraries, and the Association of College and Research Libraries. But of course, the views I'm expressing today are my own, but have a remarkable coincidence with their views. With respect to this whole underlying issue of 108, is it obsolete? Yes, it's obsolete, and certainly as an academic exercise, which would be appropriate here at Columbia University, we can talk about how do we update it. What would be the best way to improve it? But as someone who's been involved in the trenches lobbying, and I'm a registered lobbyist, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, I think that from a political point of view, reopening 108 would be not a good idea. And let me give you a few reasons why. First of all, I think it would be extremely difficult to reach any kind of agreement. We saw that just with the 108 working group, and that was with sort of knowledgeable, informed people without all the members of Congress to bring along. And they, at the end of the day, did not reach agreement. They reached a sort of high-level agreement on some issues, but on a lot of issues didn't reach agreement at all, and certainly didn't come up with statutory language other than in a couple of very narrow areas. So it would be very hard to take agreement. It would take a long time if we ever did reach agreement. Because of the nature of the political dynamic, lobbying strength of the relative parties, the sort of pervasive sort of concern with the enforcement agenda and so forth, I think that the legislation that could emerge, if any legislation did emerge, could very well make libraries worse off than they are now, not better. So even though a lot of us sort of, in the library community would say we want to do this to make 108 work better and improve the situation of libraries, I think it could very well be counterproductive and we could be worse off. It would certainly be incredibly complicated, and we had that question before that Dwayne raised. As complicated as 108 is now, and it's already very hard for librarians to understand, based on when Lolly was showing her slides about the kinds of things that were being talked about, it looks like it'll be a whole lot more complicated, and so that much more difficult, so that even Dwayne Butler's mechanic, even he will not be able to understand how to do it. Also, I think that already now there are other issues, more pressing issues, as we heard. The 108 working group left certain very important issues off the agenda, and there were going to be even more important issues that will be off of the agenda. And let me just finish that we all understand that so again, more pressing issues like licensing and so forth, those are not going to be addressed, and so you sort of say, what's the point of taking all this time to address and not reach the real issues? And then at the base, what is the real problem? What is really causing so much of the complexity here, at least for libraries? And we all know, the elephant in the room, it's copyright term. Copyright term is way too long. If you shorten copyright term, then so many of these problems would go away or be reduced. But, that is, again, from a political point of view, not going to happen or very unlikely to happen, especially with all our international agreements. So the real solution to the problem is already off the table. Okay,
John, thank you. And we'll roll up our sleeves and delve into the language of Section 108 and also return to some of these broader discussions. Mark.
So, even though it's insoluble and there's no potential resolution, I still think it's worthwhile to discuss. So, from an Elsevier perspective, major international publisher of academic and professional materials, and we're part of the international company Reed Elsevier, which also includes LexisNexis. So we're really publishing for the research and academic community, and our major customers are research-oriented institutional educational libraries and institutions. So our primary interest in debates and discussions about things like Section 108 and broadly about copyright matters is to try to ensure that there continues to be a market space, even in the academic and research environment, to support investment, to support engagement, and sort of in a corollary fashion to make sure that the corporate markets, which aren't our primary markets but which are important, continue to pay their fair share. So I'm thinking of industries such as energy, pharmaceutical, chemistry, and the like. Any transition is difficult, and the transition from print to digital has been far from smooth. It's certainly difficult for legislatures, I think, to contemplate what the new environment actually looks like and what it provides and what the appropriate sort of metaphors for past uses and past exceptions in the print environment and what they should look like in the digital environment. I still think that the fundamental sort of balancing interests that are discussed and mentioned, even with respect to the 76 Act, are still relevant today, and they have to be thought through from the perspective of what it means for the digital environment. My thinking is that more focus on sector-specific approaches is the right way of thinking. If you will, a bit of a kind of a soft law approach on many of these points. I don't think we'll really be able to address, the entire range of copyright works and the entire range of archival and preservation purposes in one overarching copyright law. However, I do think that we could look at things at a sector-by-sector basis and come up with reasonable approaches. That does require some dialogue, and it does require actually sitting down together, but I do think that that's an appropriate and a positive way forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Mary.
Thank you. Well, I too definitely hear from the library community fears that we don't have the political muscle to make things better, and in fact, it could get worse. However, I believe there are important changes that we need. And the current issue that I see exploding in libraries is ebooks. A combination of the bygone copyright law, bygone era, and the weak negotiating power of libraries could leave us without strong collections in the near future. Talk about collection building, this is collection shrinking. The core value that libraries offer is the safety value, so that everybody doesn't have to pay to read everything. How often does an author say, "But for the library, I wouldn't have written my novel"? We need libraries for the preservation of books for the future, and ebooks are important to libraries because there's more ebooks, with more ebooks than print, and many are only as ebooks. Where does that leave library users? The digital environment makes possible a creative array of licensing models that are beneficial to both content owners and library users. Books disappear at the end of a 2-week loan. How great is that? But relying solely on the marketplace is leaving important gaps that public policy can fill. Because at the end of the day, the library needs collections, not access. We need to be able to preserve, to do interlibrary loan, and to do replacements. And without first sale, the libraries are beholden to embargoes, to missing titles completely. And a library copyright exception could make an enormous difference. For example, if a library copyright exception ensured that for every title purchased or licensed, the library has a right to make an archival copy using the safeguards that Lolly had discussed on the last panel, we could envision a library for the future. If a library copyright exception ensured that interlibrary loans don't evaporate under licenses, then a library user who yesterday could request a 3-year-old book on an obscure military aircraft, but tomorrow cannot because the copies are restricted and cannot move, then we risk an enormous loss of sharing resources. But a copyright law exception could ensure interlibrary loan with a one-book, one-user model. It doesn't have to be constrained by license if we have a strong enough exception. I see a future where we can have an interlibrary loan system. Right now we have a spectrum of returnables that don't implicate copyright law because it's a print book, comes back, no issue. And then the non-returnables where 108 makes provisions to allow us to make the copies. What I see in the ebook world is something I would call it's a super returnable because the patron, it comes back after 2 weeks whether they want it to or not. Finally, I think that we could make an enormous difference if we had a copyright exception to allow us the reproduction and distribution of an entire book if the library has determined on a reasonable investigation that a copy cannot be obtained at a fair price, because we are missing titles right now, and we need help. Thank you.
Okay, we have a lot to delve into. And Eric.
Oh, thank you. I won't delve into a lot. First, thanks to to June and Jane and all at the Kernochan Center, and to Maria and everyone at the Copyright Office. I look around and realize among a lot of colleagues, we've been doing this for a long time. I found notes from the early 1990s on programs that I had participated on when I was at the U.S. Copyright Office. I think I'm here, first of all, I know I'm here speaking on behalf of no clients, and nor am I here on behalf of an organization I helped found that works with archives called the National Film Preservation Foundation. But I think I am here speaking from my experience, both of 25 years as a copyright lawyer and 25 years as a film preservationist and archivist, and now doing recorded sound preservation and archiving as well. The organization that I started in '97 supports libraries and archives and is geared specifically to the preservation of orphan works. And so in its 15-year existence, we have both saved and made accessible materials. My colleagues probably in the audience would sort of scorn the sort of size and scope of the organization, 2,000 films preserved and everything else. But what I will say from experience is in doing multi-archival distribution of materials, clearing rights over 15 years of materials, 5 DVD sets, 2 more coming this year, with including the first film that Alfred Hitchcock was credited on, and one of the early John Ford silents. We've never received a dunning letter from anyone in terms of our inability to make materials accessible. Our screening line at our website at filmpreservation.org has never had a takedown notification. It can be done. It's tedious and difficult, but it can be done. So I'm here sort of with 2 messages. On the purpose of 108, and I think the purpose for why we're here, everyone's talking about access, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Number 1 is preservation. And I think to looking especially at students in the audience, digitization is not a preservation medium for film, not yet. All of the studios that are shooting on digital are transferring their material to 35 millimeter film and storing it in archives. Okay, so let's be clear about what we're talking about. It probably will be soon, hopefully, but it's not there. And the issues of preservation are not legal issues, they're money issues. The archives need money, and that's true for recorded sound as well. So we can talk about the law, but in terms about the tremendous role that libraries and archives have undertaken, it's about retention and collection of material. On access, in the remaining 1 minute, a few things. I mean, clearly we are delving into not the traditional roles, but the redefining the status of libraries. The best way, I think, to address these issues is to unbundle the issues, as is being done at least panel-wise here. Mass digitization is not the same and doesn't raise the same issues as orphan works. Neither does the basic work of libraries and archives under 108. I think the way you break up the access issues is sort of threefold: by users, by use, and by the works. And that includes in works by age. Jonathan mentioned term, but 108H, my contribution to Section 108 was drafting. 108H says that in the last 20 years of copyright, libraries or archives can make materials available if they're not otherwise essentially being made available. And then the how to fix it really comes down to three ways. One is by private agreement. More material has been made available by libraries and archives in the sound area by contract in the last few years than any other way. The Sony Music Agreement with the Library of Congress made all pre-1925 recordings, so 80% of the commercial recordings, publicly available for free right now. Go to the National Jukebox online, Library of Congress. 2, the Universal Music Agreement, largest donation of recorded sound materials ever to a library or archive. The second way is legislation, and as Jonathan says, and I've been in the trenches, I worked 10 years on the Hill, it will only come by agreement of the parties. I'm not giving anyone new news to note that Congress is broken. Overall, forget copyright. And the only way that's going to happen is if the parties in sessions like this and more intensely work it out. And third is by litigation. And there, it seems to be that the libraries are content to allow fair use at the moment to sort of dictate their activities. But pendulums swing, and they swing back and forth. And my work with libraries and archives tells me that what the archivists want is certainty. And starting the discussion by saying fair use is fact-based determinative, it's very complicated. Let me begin with the 4 factors. The archivists I work for, they say, stop. I can't do it, because that doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't help them in a practical sense. So I really do think the certainty of a 108 fix is something, it's hard work, but I think it's worth doing.
Thank you. We actually have a number, so we've had very interesting comments. We also have a number of questions that we've been asked to consider. So I'd like to review those with the panelists, and then we can respond and address some of these topics that have been raised. So kind of rolling up our sleeves and starting in, should the 108 exceptions be limited to libraries and archives or extended to other institutions? Eric, let's start with you.
Well, certainly I would go back to the 108 report, and I'm, speaking again on my own behalf, I'm perfectly fine adding museums. The one thing that I would say is that the 108 has or needs clearer eligibility standards for the institutions that would qualify. It does seem to me that the broader you make the number of institutions that qualify under 108, the natural inclination of rights holders is going to be to narrow the ability of those institutions, now larger and larger numbers, to make materials accessible. And so I think in that counterbalance, you have to be cautious to say, yes, you want to add more for the purposes of preservation and access and filling those niches that rights holders aren't or other institutions aren't. But I do worry that if you don't have strong eligibility standards for the institutions that can and do qualify, what you're going to have is a more of a tightening of the ability of what they can do under the right to both reproduce and distribute, which is, after all, what all 108 is exceptions in the reproduction and distribution right.
John? Okay.
So, as I said before, in general, I would be very concerned about reopening 108. The 2 exceptions where I could see conceivably a very narrow technical fix would be on this issue, including museums. And then also, what we'll probably get to, the number of preservation copies and using a reasonable number as opposed to 3. So those would be 2 in theory, very simple technical fixes. But to some extent, again, what I'm concerned about is the dynamic that would then unfold. And to some extent, I think it was just even suggested right now by Eric. So I would say just add "and museums," right? Just add those 2 words. And maybe you would actually only need to add museums and not an "and." But, so you add 1 word. But then all of a sudden, some group is going to say, ooh, we need to define what a museum is. And, oh, we need to define what a library is. We need to define what an archive is, because maybe someone out there is going to abuse it. And it's like, has 108 been abused till now? Well, no, of course not. But there's this, the political dynamic sort of invites this people coming out of the woodwork and kind of paranoid delusions that will then, even the narrowest, simplest technical correction will be hijacked, and it will take, even if we just limit it to those 2 corrections, that can easily take 2 Congresses to work out.
Mary.
I kind of disagree with that, because I think that times are different now. Everybody's calling themselves a library or a museum or an archive, and so I think it's reasonable actually to define what a professional staff is, a public service mission, et cetera, as recommended in the report. I would include virtual libraries if they meet those criteria. So that would be one broadening as well as a narrowing.
I agree with that comment. I think I'm quite flexible about, for example, the creation of purely online libraries and online resources, such as archives. I do think, however, that in order to expand that, you do have to have obligations and requirements for professional standards. In the STM journal space, for example, archiving electronic journals requires a lot of expertise and care about things like digital formats, preserving links and the like. It's not easy stuff to do, and I do think that the notion that this can best be done with professional staff that understand both those kinds of requirements and the legal obligations that are there is appropriate. So expand in terms of virtual, absolutely. There's no reason why this should be limited to bricks and mortar, but I do think that the notion of standards and professionalism should continue and perhaps need to be expanded on a bit.
Well, again, the problem is now something very simple is going to get very complicated, and it's always the fear. Yes, in theory, yes, someone, if it's not defined, and doesn't have the standards of in professionalism, maybe someone out there will abuse it. But what is the likelihood of that happening, of the abuse? And given sort of all the other people out there who are abusing the copyright law, to be worried about this community and someone calling themselves an online library, and I just think, again, in the grand scheme of things, this is not where it's worth arguing about. There's a simple fix, and we should just do it. And if not, let's just rely on fair use.
Okay. Moving on a little bit, should libraries and archives be permitted to capture content from the web? And should this content be limited in any way? I know John has said it's a new day for web archiving, but before you get there.
Okay, well, I'm just very quickly, it seems to me that if two of the largest and most successful corporations in the world, Google and Microsoft, are archiving the World Wide Web all the time, it just doesn't seem to me why should there be any issue about libraries and archives doing it. They do it under a fair use theory. Google in a very public way, Microsoft in a very quiet way, but they're both relying on fair use to do what they're doing. So I'm just not sure why we even need to have a statutory exception to do it. It's, there's good case line. Yes, at some point maybe the pendulum will swing the other way, but I have a feeling that the likelihood of that happening is very small, at least when we're talking about, websites and website archiving, that, again, it's currently being done by these very large corporations, and to come up with a statutory exception, again, it would be needless complication.
Eric, then Mary.
Again, to harken back to the 108 recommendation, certainly on websites it makes sense. I always joke that stating the obvious is my forte, but to state the obvious, I don't think that rights holders are as concerned about what's incoming into qualified libraries and archives as what's outgoing. So the ingestion is not necessarily the concern. I do think that it also should be done respecting the terms and conditions of the rights holders on the websites. That what is being taken, I do believe in respecting those rights, whatever they are. Again, there's the tension between what is being done for the purposes of preserving material so that it'll be available for posterity and in making it accessible.
I was going to say that this is an area where the study's recommendations have really become the common law. I mean, libraries are already doing it. It hasn't really been an issue. I've seen libraries that cite this recommendation as though it's law. So, it seems like that part's working pretty well.
So I think it makes, the Internet is basically the kind of mass literature that archives that are sort of trying to preserve earlier eras are forced to do. We used to have things like regional newspapers and all sorts of other things that would be preserved in order to have that legacy. And I'm glad to hear that that's being preserved. I do think, however, that there are conditions out there that creators and others are setting. And although the notion of kind of observing robots.txt in terms of crawling and that kind of stuff is a good one, I think that there are other technologies and other online licenses, including some of the Creative Commons licenses out there, that make quite clear what the terms and conditions are that are being set, and I think somehow those have to be recognized and acknowledged. So that's...
And should there be any exceptions to that recognition, or any that you can identify?
Well, one thing that I was going to mention earlier, and it goes to the duration, and it's a bit the opposite of Eric's discussion about the last 20 years of film, but I do think that, there's a question about timing, and I do think that as material is out there and is not refreshed, and as websites and creators are not actively doing something with the site, it does seem to me that there's a potential that it kind of falls into the ether somewhere. So it does seem to me that there's some discussion that we could have about exceptions in terms of timing and frequency. More active websites that are really sort of actively setting out terms and conditions and monitoring what's going on, I think should be looked at more skeptically or more carefully.
Robot.txt was mentioned, and I think it's important. This is exactly the kind of space where it's important for there not to be statutory provisions, and instead we rely on fair use and the judgment of librarians. My understanding is that there's all kinds of reasons why website developers use headers and exclusion headers and robot.txt and so forth. And a lot of it, or in fact most of it, has absolutely nothing to do with copyright, but it has all sorts of things to do with traffic management or just sort of default settings that people use without thinking. And so if you have an exception that excludes websites that use those exclusion headers, then and that's what a library would have to follow, then a large and important material that perhaps is not appropriate to be crawled by Google or Microsoft, but is appropriate to be crawled by a library for preservation purposes would get excluded. So I think that's exactly why the fair use framework and sort of trusting the judgment of librarians works better than having sort of a fixed congressional mandate.
I think, to me, what it suggests also is that these things need to be looked at almost on a site-by-site basis, as many of the large search engines that you mentioned, Jonathan, do. That is that I think for a particular library archival project, I think the organizers should sort of think about which types of websites and which specific sites they want to capture and archive, and if there are issues about robot.txt or terms and conditions that might conflict with that, reach out to those sites and have discussions with them.
Is it possible to contact those sites all the time, or what would some of the implications be of that, Mary? I don't know if you've...
And I think that in fact is the practical problem that libraries are encountering, that they do reach out to the websites and they never hear back.
It's about a 50-50 return.
Do you have any, would there be moments where you would allow that without the permission?
I mean, I'm not crazy about the notion of an opt-out. There's something I'm slightly allergic to about that phrase, but I could imagine in those kinds of circumstances that might be an appropriate approach.
That sort of does then raise the question of does every library and archive or qualified library and archive need to do this? One, it's not a good use of resources, and two, in other words, why, as in a demand deposit world, why not permit the Library of Congress? Again, to some institutions, and I look around the room at some of my colleagues, they're going to say, does it, it's not necessarily fair for one institution to be the only one to be permitted to do it. But on the other hand, that is what Congress made decisions about, both with regard to copying of television news programs and other exceptions, with the idea being that this was being retained for a preservation purpose. The question then comes, if the library itself is not making the material accessible, that's a different public policy issue. But if it's a question of if not them, it would be lost, or if not anybody, it would be lost, then allow one institution to do it. But I'm not sure you need necessarily to allow every institution to do it all the time.
Mary?
The reason some libraries want to do it on their own is they are taking subsets, very small subsets of curated collections, so that it's the disaster of Sandy or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So is there an issue of timeliness or balancing collections? Can Library of Congress do all of this wherever the Library of Congress people are? Yes.
And I think having a careful opt-out, and the recommendations in the study group are really very carefully done, where there's a last resort, there's an opt-out, there's a different standard for political parties. I think that was very thought out.
Okay. I'm going to move along a little because we do want to leave a lot of time for questions. So Eric spoke a little bit about the changes necessary with respect to the exceptions for preservation. Are there other comments that people want to follow up on that? Does Eric want to follow? What exceptions are necessary for preservation?
I think the answer is whatever exceptions are necessary for preservation. That really and doing work, looking at Eric and Dwayne and others on and Jenny pre-72 sound recordings. We in a roundtable discussion, obviously pre-72 sound recordings protected not by federal law, not by 108, question raised in terms of the activities of archives to preserve this material where the law is not covered under federal law. The question that was asked at the roundtable was whether or not any library or archive or any of the organizations represented around the room had ever received a letter from a rights holder saying, stop your activity. And the answer was no. And my experience in working with film archives is the same. The answer is no. So if the law just needs to catch up to the practice on that in the number of copies, and digitization certainly is a preservation medium for sound recordings if done at the right technical standards for the copying and everything else. There's another crisis, which is that we don't have the technical expertise. You don't have enough young people who understand the old technologies, and you need schooling and everything else for that. That's not a copyright law issue, but it's very much a real and live issue, and I think we need to do that. With regard to whatever the exceptions are, published or unpublished, it seems to me not relevant as long as it is being retained for preservation purposes. But then again, I raise the question, must the exception apply for every archive? Must every archive be doing it? And I think there it's more a matter of the dividing of the efforts, as is done in the film community in particular, with a lot of cooperation both among the archives and between the archives and rights holders, which is not something we've discussed, but there's an awful lot that goes on below the surface of the law in terms of private agreement and participation, and the sharing of costs, which I think needs to continue.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think I sort of agree with what Eric was saying, but I'm not 100% sure.
And water out.
Right, and so but I think certainly, to the extent that the question is do we need to amend 108 to allow it? And again, before I indicated, I think that you could. That might be an area. Getting rid of the numerical limit and talk about a reasonable number. That might be something worth considering if there was a way to make sure that it was only that and it didn't sort of open up a whole can of worms, which is always a problem. But again, this is an area where I think, and I think to some extent, this is where I think Eric and I agree. It seems that in terms of current practice, there isn't really a problem because people are doing that preservation anyway, and to the extent that there is a legal theory undergirding their activity, it's of course fair use. And that's why, just getting back to something, a comment made Maria made before, talking about saying, well, you have these options. You can leave things the way they are. You can repeal 108 or amend 108. I think that there's no reason to even think about repealing 108 because 108 does guide 107, and so there's this. I hate to sound like a law professor citing an article that I wrote, a law review article that I wrote, but it is in the current Journal of the Copyright Society, an article that I wrote that talks about how you can use fair use to sort of update out of exceptions that might be a little bit out of date, and so and certainly we talk about I talk about 108 extensively as a way that sort of can guide courts, and so to the extent that 108 doesn't quite get you there, you have substantial compliance. 107 can sort of take you across the line. So I think at least in preservation. As opposed to access to preservation, and I agree that there's a distinction that Eric's making there. I agree with that distinction, but I think 107 plus 108 get you where you need to be.
Mary or Mark?
I think I agree with most of the comments made in terms also concerning the numeric limits. I do think that there's probably more work that needs to happen to look at the question of format shifting. Section 108 does address the question of obsolete formats, but it does seem to me that there's probably more work that could be done to expand this area. I think one of the challenges we see on the journal archiving side is that electronic formats change fairly quickly, and when they change, they become unreadable and really difficult to work with. And ironically, paper is better in some respects.
Just, many of you know this, but the only reference in the House or Senate reports of the 76 Act in fair use to the copying of an entire work was for essentially a format shifting for films, although the date was incorrect in the report. It made reference to the fact that nitrate film materials pre-1942, nitrate materials, the more fragile material on film was used until 1952, was an example of the copying that was permissible for a preservation purpose only, and it was only the format shifting purpose, and certainly in other formats. Someone talking about tapes earlier this morning and others, that's necessary. But again, I just think that the practices are what they are today. It would be helpful, I think, for some smaller institutions that don't have legal counsel. This is my mantra for the day for the why you need a 108 reform. The legal counsel, as I always joke, in these smaller institutions never got fired for saying no. And so when asked if anything can be done, their first response is no. And I think to the extent that you can make the practices clear in 108 to what they currently are, certainly for preservation and retention purposes, certainly for transferring formats for deteriorating fragile material, the better it will be for all of the institutions, not just the ones represented here, but a lot of the smaller historical societies and others that don't have the counsel and just need to know. Just answer my question, yes, no, counsel. Don't give me the four factors.
Well, to some extent, on that specific issue with respect to preservation, I think something like the ARL Code of Best Practices for Fair Use can satisfy that need, and actually perhaps better than 108 because it's a lot easier to understand.
Brandon's shaking his head.
All right. I'm going to move to a new question. What changes are needed for Section 108, if any, for Section 108D and E to allow libraries and archives to make and distribute single copies to users, including copies by interlibrary loan? We talked a little bit about it at the beginning, but should these exceptions be amended in light of the increasing use of digital technologies by libraries and archives?
Well, since Nancy's looking at me, I guess.
It's a little interesting being in the middle.
Yeah. Well, I guess especially to the extent that so much of, that interlibrary loan issue is really, very, I don't know the percentages, and perhaps, Martha does know the percentages, but I would imagine so much of it really is, in the, scholarly educational market, that's where it really takes place. And so, what I would like to believe is that in 10 years, so much of that market will be open access, then it will be, this issue will wither away. Now, maybe not everyone on the panel agrees with this or thinks that that's a desirable outcome, but to some extent, I really do think that this is I would like to think that this is, again, an area where the market and changes in the market will overtake any kind of statutory issues.
So, ironically, I kind of agree, although from a slightly different perspective. So, I do think that there are lots of market solutions out there, and open access in terms of sustainable access that means that content is free at the point of usage is certainly one of those. But there are also license alternatives and transactional opportunities as well to purchase and obtain individual articles, for example, from journals. So there is a fairly robust market and a developing market. And I do agree that one always needs to look at exceptions and limitations carefully in light of the current market and market developments. I suspect that the issue that we often deal with in scholarly publishing is a long tail. So, the many thousands of publishers around the world, the many small societies, for example, that publish only one or two journals. And for that matter, that the other long tail on terms of the user side, which is that not all institutions and all libraries are going to have the same sort of breadth of collection and the same orientation in terms of subject matter. So somehow there probably will still be a space that it is not completely filled by the market options and market alternatives. And I do think that, therefore, there will continue to be a space for exceptions and limitations here. They have to be, I think, carefully calibrated to think about the market. And as far as digital access and digital copies, I'm quite supportive of the notion that in the digital environment, people need electronic documents. That makes perfect sense to me. Over the past couple of years, a number of publishers have done some FOIA requests of some public universities to look at patterns of document delivery or interlibrary loan in terms of geographic distribution. And there, some of the results have been odd. And this is an area where I think we do need sometimes to look at patterns and to think about patterns. So, for example, the notion that we found that U.S. libraries should deliver copies to Canadian libraries or French libraries or perhaps even Chinese libraries, I'm not entirely sure I understand the logic of that. I do accept and understand the logic of U.S. libraries or French or Chinese or Canadian libraries delivering copies to the developing world, to countries where there is not the kind of collection resources that we might see in other parts of the world. So, I mean, it's that kind of calibration of what are we doing, what is that long tail, what does the market look like, and what are the needs that we're trying to fill, and not sort of substituting for market solutions that I think is critical.
I think that having a mix like we have today, using the Cantu guidelines, the Rule of Five, plus the document delivery with payment going to the publishers is a good solution. I think that if there's bad actors, we need to find them out. But the system, I think, works pretty well. I also think, in terms of making that necessary copy to transmit, this permeates all of digital works, and I don't think that we should item by item say as many copies as necessary. I think we should actually have a definitional change of 106 reproduction rights, and that right should reflect persistent copies and not these necessary transitory essential copies. I think that should be in the definition or in a new section that expands 117 or 112 ephemeral recordings. But be done with that. I mean, the model is out there with the clouds. It's multi-billion-dollar model. Everybody's using the essential transitory copies. Eric?
So again, I think this comes back to users' use and works, breakdown. If we're talking truly about interlibrary loan and the types of activities, I know at dinner last night we were talking about libraries and record keeping, and one of the areas that's sort of built into the library system is record keeping in and for interlibrary loan, for one. And so I think that there have to be some, for rights holders, ability to feel secure about the activities that are being undertaken. Some types of securities to keep the use and users to what is intended and not unintended. Look, libraries and archives are the institutions that most uphold the copyright law, and that is their mission to balance that and also to serve the public. So I think that they are good at it. It sort of comes full circle back to the first question we were asking about what is and what is not a qualified library or archive and museum. And I think, again, the more the universe is defined about who the actors are, and the more clearly you define who the users are and for the purpose, the better you are. I don't think that becomes an issue unless you're talking about much broader access beyond interlibrary loan.
Well, I'll just give, again, a very quick plug for my article, because I sort of addressed the issue that to the extent that 108 D&E might not allow exactly what we think we need to do, fair use guided by that, sort of saying what is the functional equivalent. So, first of all, I think that 108 D does allow electronic document delivery, but to the extent that it doesn't, clearly, 107 as a gloss on 108 would allow you to do it, and so that's why we have the flexibility already to do what needs to be done.
No, I was just thinking, why do we have the problem with ebooks and not with journals? It's all licensed. It's because in the licenses with the journals, it typically says this will not override 107, 108, and we don't have that with the ebooks, and that's a serious problem. Similar to the up issue that was brought up earlier.
So I'm not sure that actually our licenses deal with that language. So
They do.
well, hopefully they don't always anyway. The problem that I would have with that is that, okay, so if the librarian customer can explain to me exactly what they want to do under Section 107, then that's something we can talk about.
Yeah.
So I do think that licenses need to be very clear, and they need to address the key issues that the institutional libraries have. So I think they should address archiving. I think they should address interlibrary loan, and I think most of them do. Again, you do sometimes have long tail issues, so that there will be some journals which haven't sort of thought through all these issues, and that may be a problem. I also think, sometimes I get complaints, or I hear complaints. For example, there was a British Library submission a while ago with 100 terrible licenses, if I remember right. And my guess is, although I didn't look at every single one, but my guess is most of those terrible licenses from the British Library perspective were probably software licenses or sort of mass market licenses of one kind or another, which, I think I would argue that those kinds of mass market licenses have some utility and probably in terms of transactional costs are fairly efficient, but I do accept that they don't really address all of the issues that are probably of more significance and more concern to the institutional customer.
So do you think that the copyright exception should trump licenses in those types of situations?
No, I guess I'm a believer in freedom of contract, so I think people should negotiate what they think is relevant and what works for them.
I think it's time to open this up a little bit and make sure that we get some questions. Okay. I think here came first.
I'm going to just start from that.
If you could say your name.
Oh, Gloria Ferris. I'm with Patterson, Philadelphia, and Tyler, and I represent people on all sides of this. But let's just go back to that last comment about the mass market license. I mean, is not part of the problem in this area that frequently people are unable to talk to the other side of the contract, and so that the notion of a freely agreed upon license is a complete fiction, and that is in fact having very wide-ranging effects on broad aspects of copyright, including the increasing absence of first sales.
Well, so my involvement in license negotiations and license drafting is kind of on the other end. It's large contracts with complex issues about archiving and interlibrary loans. So I'm not an expert in mass market licenses. However, I think I would say that if we're talking about a license to use Microsoft Word in your institution, I don't know. To me, it doesn't seem that is something that really is worthy, frankly, of an extensive negotiation. I mean, I'm just saying there is a reason why mass market licenses are very efficient and very effective, and hopefully they don't deal with resources and services which are really, frankly, vital in terms of the collection programs that institutions and libraries have. If they were, if, for example, a publisher was trying to use a very standard sort of mass market license that comes more from the software environment to deal with these kinds of complex issues, then I think, they should be called out and should be specific negotiations should happen to make sure it doesn't happen in that way.
Okay. Oh, Mary, did you?
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of negotiating in e-books, the libraries are told by the vendors, you're 5% of our market, and the publishers don't want to sell to you anyway. So we really have nothing to say we want to include in the license a 108 exception.
And not to address the mass market license question, but should licenses trump the 108 exceptions? Just looking in my universe, maybe only my universe, the answer I think is yes, and the reason is because of donor agreements. So the one thing you do want to do in the library and archival world, certainly for the non-print material especially, is to encourage donations. And the way you do that is by allowing the contracts of the donors to govern, also in the print world for manuscripts and other things, but especially in the film and sound recording worlds and other materials. And I think you want to encourage that because you want them to come into these institutions, and you don't want the donors to walk away thinking that, notwithstanding their agreement, that whatever happens to the materials in terms of making it accessible will happen.
I would think that there are ways to sort of split the baby, and to some extent we've identified them. I mean, that there's it would seem to me that certainly if you do have an arm's length negotiation between entities of equal bargaining strength, that then it would make sense for the terms of the license to trump copyright law. On the other hand, when you do have a mass market license, there might be all kinds of good public policy reasons to have the public law of copyright trump sort of like this private law of copyright to the private law of contract, especially to the extent that you're waiving things like first sale and fair use and so forth. And so there really are serious public policy implications. It could very well be that there really is already, those terms might be preempted. A lot of the cases that have looked at the issue have always focused on 301A preemption, but there are a couple of cases that look at constitutional preemption, and I think that's one of those issues that might ultimately have to be sort of percolate up through the courts and be resolved by the Supreme Court ultimately, because that's one of those areas where I just don't think that there will ever be agreement in Congress, even though from time to time people do raise that issue.
All right, lightning round questions. I think you were next. There and then there.
I'm Stephanie Gross again from Yeshiva University. I read with some manner of surprise Amazon's public disclosure that they were intending to allow resale of digital books. Professor Minow, I'm addressing this to you. I'm just wondering if this is some sort of a sign of a thaw in the environment or some sort of a change in the mindset of publishers regarding digital content. Somewhat like, I think, maybe it was Mr. Seeley saying you have digital environment and therefore you expect electronic, that the overall environment is influencing how owners are seeing their content and changing a bit of their perspective.
I do find that hopeful, and a case to watch on that space is Capitol Records versus Redigi, which is a Massachusetts-based company that resells MP3s, and they say that if they win, they will open up a used ebook market. The issue really is, as I see it in that case, is that those transitory copies that are necessary for what I consider a lawful purpose, but we'll see. So far, the preliminary ruling allowed the case to go forward that there's a strong likelihood that Redigi will win, but we'll see.
And in terms of voluntary approaches, publishers are in fact talking about and experimenting with ideas about used e-books. I think here for these kinds of issues. There is a technical solution. I mean, the concern that publishers would have, of course, is that a digital copy is infinitely reproducible. So you sell one copy, you'd kind of like to know that the price that you have for the one copy doesn't become a price for 100 copies or 1,000 copies. But those things can be done through technology, so that a user at a time can read and access. I think that's also true on the lending side. So those things can be done through technology. And I think it would be wise of us to think about ways of using technology to do that.
William Marr, University of Illinois, where I'm the archivist. I'm sorry to make more of a comment than a question, but I think insofar as the Copyright Office is listening to things to consider for any revision, simplicity is very important. And in connection with that, I want to follow up on something I understood to have heard from Eric, and that related to both on the preservation front, both the web archiving and other kinds of copying for preservation. What I understood to have heard was an indication that maybe not all libraries or all archives need to be able to have that capacity. The fact is, while just taking web archiving or any other kind of preservation, while not all archives and nor all libraries need to be able to preserve everything, globally, they do need to be able to preserve everything that is within the scope of their mission and their responsibility, and you can't really do a competent job with a collection of local history or an institutional archives unless you can copy everything off of websites, which have a habit of kind of leaching out and going into places beyond just the fences around the institution.
Just to respond, I agree on the simplicity certainly for both preservation and especially for access. The suggestion, and it was just a suggestion, is when we were talking about what if, in the respect of the terms and conditions of the rights holders, they won't allow the copying to be made. All I was suggesting is in those instances where the preservation purpose sort of trumps anything else for the purposes of posterity, then maybe having an institution not unlike the off-air taping of television material, but only in that instance. And otherwise, all I was commenting and not being flip about it was just in terms of the archiving. I know in terms of both the film and sound recording that there is cooperation among archives. There is a discussion about who's doing what, so there's not there may be some duplications of efforts, but in a very limited resources world, it makes sense to do that. But that's all by private agreement.
Dick Rudick. I think it was Einstein who said that everything should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. My question is for Jonathan, although others may want to chime in, and it's based on a premise, which is that very few things worth doing in life are easy, and very few of those are simple. So that we have a choice, and it may not be a choice between easy and hard. It may be a choice between 107 and 108. And so it's a three-part question, but short. But short. Do you really find, I mean, there's nobody here but his chickens, do you really find 107 clear, practical for all of libraries' problems? Do you think content owners should feel the same way? I mean, do we get to have some best practices of our own? And the third question is, do you enjoy litigation? Is it fun?
Well, as a lawyer, of course I enjoy litigation. Look, it's like anything else in the world. I mean, it's like, as opposed to what, or what's the alternative? Yeah. And so, if it were up to me, I mean, I could draft a great library exception, this afternoon, and it would be, and I'm sure no one else would like it, or no one in the publishing community would like it, but I think the library community would love it. I mean, I could do that very quickly. Maybe it'll take a couple of days, actually, but still, I just think that in the current environment where where you have this huge degree of tension between the publishing community and the library community, I think to some extent it's because both of these communities are undergoing enormous transition, and so everyone is sort of wondering what is their future, and in that environment it's really hard to reach agreement on things. And then when you sort of add everything that's going on, the nature of Congress, the nature of lobbying, who has, the degree to which Congress is more responsive to moneyed interests and all those larger problems in society. I think when you have that overlay, you just end up saying, if I had to choose, which decision maker do I choose? Which decision maker do I prefer? And I think, certainly right now, it might change, but right now, I think if we had to say, who do we prefer to make these decisions, I think a lot of people in the library community would say we prefer, Article 3 judges to Congress.
Eric?
Yeah, no, but back to the point in my opening statement. Look, I work for a law firm. We litigate. It's very profitable. But if you're asking for simplicity, if you're asking, or at least as simple as it might be able to do, and clarity for the benefit, the two-pronged benefits here, preservation and access, I think there are much better alternatives than litigation, as I think Dick's third part of the question referred to. And those two are private agreement by the parties and legislation, which these days is essentially private agreement of the parties with the blessing of Congress. And I really think that both of those, it's not an either or, it's a both and answer, that those are the solutions, and litigation is not. And it really does not, I don't think, and the archivists that I work with helps the archival community to simply say, well, a judge in the Southern District of New York said this, but you're, and it's on appeal, right? I mean, in the, I've got 10 seconds, yes, no, can I do it department, the archivist just wants to know, and for that matter, the rights holders want to know what their rights are vis-a-vis that use, and I just really think private agreement, legislation by private agreement, it is very difficult, but it is worth doing.
So I just want to say that, I mean, actually, in most of the discussions that we've had on this panel, actually, it seems to me there's a lot more commonality of view and a lot more agreement. And to me, that suggests the utility of actually sitting down together and talking things through, which might wind up being, to some extent, sector-by-sector soft law approaches. Now, I know it's not popular at the moment to think about sitting down and talking together. There seems to be some positions that are kind of fixed in cement on certain poles, but personally, I don't think there's any other solution, frankly.
So let's sit down and talk about this together over lunch. Thank you to everybody on the panel.